Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Trauma Exposure and Recovery, a practical guide to caring for ourselves and others during the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Jennifer Erf and I'm with the Massachusetts Association for Mental Health. On behalf of MAMH, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, and the Massachusetts Aging and Mental Health Coalition, we're very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. As you may know, May is a time when we traditionally recognize both Mental Health Awareness Month and Older Americans Month. So it's fitting that today we recognize, honor, and support the many caregivers who are working with older adults and others who may have mental health needs and who are most at risk during COVID-19. And we're very pleased that Mary Curlew is able to join us today to help us do that. We are at full capacity today, which is awesome. We have more than 250 people signed in to participate in the webinar today. So to accommodate everybody, you are in listen only mode, but we really want to encourage you to ask questions and make comments throughout the presentation. So Mary's promised to stop a few times during the presentation to make time for questions and comments. So if you look at the control panel on the right of your screen, you'll see a pane for questions. Just enter your questions there at any time. The questions will go only to the organizers, and then we'll present them verbally to Mary so she can respond. While you're also looking at the control panel, you'll see a pane that is for, I think it's called handouts. So in there, you'll see for download both the PowerPoints for today's presentation and also the trauma response workbook that Mary will be referring to during her presentation. So feel free to download those. You can print those and have those for your own use. We'll also be recording the webinar today, and we'll send you a link to the recording and the webinar materials afterward. So with that, I'd like to turn the webinar over to today's moderator, Rob Walker. Many of you already know Rob from his role with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health's Office of Recovery and Empowerment, and also his role as co-chair of the Massachusetts Elder Mental Health Collaborative. So welcome, Rob, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm so happy to have DMH co-sponsor this webinar about trauma exposure and recovery. That a lot of us in the audience have difficult jobs in this time of COVID-19 and this time of loss. And we're just now taking the time to reflect on how it affects us. I think as helpers, professional helpers, we spend our time worrying about the people we're supposed to be helping and not thinking about ourselves. So I'm very happy that you all could take an hour and a half out of your time to start thinking about yourself and thinking about the impact that exposure to trauma has in your own life, and get some great hints on how to recover and how to process the trauma. So I'm very excited to have Mary Curlew as our speaker. Mary's the community education and training specialist with Jewish Family and Children's Services, and she's a webinar star these last couple of months working with other organizations around trauma. So I'd like to turn it over to Mary, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Jennifer. And I want to say a special thank you to our partners too, the Massachusetts Aging and Mental Health Coalition, which I'm a member of, as well as the Department of Mental Health more generally, and the Massachusetts Association of Mental Health more generally as well. It's a wonderful group to work with. I really encourage you to maybe look up when we have our monthly meetings and participate with us in addressing issues around older adults and mental health, which happens to be May is the month for Recognize Older Americans Month, as well as to recognize Mental Health Awareness Month. So this seems apropos that we're discussing how to take care of ourselves in the midst of addressing the needs of older Americans and the mental health concerns that we see in that population, as well as we see in ourselves. That's really the purpose of this this workshop, this webinar, is to provide you with some tools you can use, not only for your clients, but also for yourself. I happen to be trained in EMDR and dialectical behavioral therapy, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive processing therapy, which all, fancy words for addressing the issues of trauma in our lives. And part of each one of those training modalities, there's always a part about resource development and developing tools that can help our clients deal with the distress and the impact of trauma in their lives. So as Marsha Linehan, who started dialectical behavioral therapy, is quick to point out, is that we need to use these tools and practice them ourselves if we're going to try to teach them to others. And you don't need to be trained in any of these modalities to be able to use these tools. So that's my real hope. And I'll say a little bit more about how I see this as self-care, how I see this as a way to respond to vicarious traumatization, whether you call it secondary trauma or compassion fatigue. But these are really effective tools that you can use when we practice them regularly. That's my hope. I do hope also that you'll be, the first half will be mostly psychoeducation, which is a strong component of trauma therapy. And during that time, I encourage you to write in the chat function any questions that come up as we go along. You may have been taught as a student when you were in elementary school not to raise your hand while the teacher is speaking. In this case, you're more than welcome to raise your hand by putting something in the chat function to ask a question. And we will pause in the middle of this workshop to answer some of those questions regarding the psychoeducation about how this works. The second half will be more focused on actually practicing. So I will lead you through a couple of tools from EMDR, dialectical behavioral therapy, and cognitive processing or cognitive behavioral therapy that you can use on a daily basis. And I always tell my clients, I'm not just the hair club president, I'm also a client. I do use these tools regularly myself. So I really do encourage you to practice this, ask lots of questions as we go along. This workshop is for you to give you some things that can help you through this traumatic time. So I kind of gave you a bit of the objectives. And again, the main objective is to participate in some psychoeducation, which is also a component of the trauma therapy that we provide to our clients, to discuss the key components and tools of trauma recovery, what's really important for you to have in your daily life to support your own recovery, your own resilience, your own healing, and then plan and practice using these tools. And that's what we'll do at the last half. So I want to take a moment to get a sense of where you're at right now in your stress levels. So for some of you who may have been coming on to this webinar with the hope of sitting back and hearing some mindfulness and meditation in order to help you feel more relaxed in the moment, sorry, I do have some training in mindfulness and meditation personally as well as professionally, and I find that can be really helpful. Today we're talking about traumatic stress though. And with traumatic stress, we really need to look at what those stressors are. We need to address those before we go into that resource development, before we go into distress tolerance. So I'm going to push you a little bit to sort of recognize some of that distress so we don't walk away from it too soon. So you have this both in your workbook as well as on your screen. In your workbook, it is it's a lot like this. That's helpful for you. And it's the Holmes Life Stress Inventory. I'm not going to ask you to score this. I'm just going to ask you to take a look at this list and just notice. Notice what researchers and have looked at as major stressors, and they're weighted. The one at the top, death of a spouse, is obviously going to cause a lot more stress in our lives, acute stress, than major holidays or vacation. So each one of these are items that do cause stress in our lives. I'd like you to take just a moment to look it over and count how many stressors you have in your current life right now. I'm curious, as many of us look at this list, we'll probably recognize things that we are all sharing in common right now. Major change in living condition would be one of them. For many of us, for all of us actually, we're not allowed or not able to go out to the same extent as we had before. We're not able to engage with each other in the same way that we did before. There's major changes in our work hours or conditions. Many of us or our children ceased formal schooling or changed schooling in some way. They had to work from home. Spouse beginning or ceasing work outside the home. Major change in social activities. Major change in church activity. Major change in sleeping habits, which a lot of the research has been showing that during COVID-19, the majority of us are having problems sleeping, having major sleep disruption, vivid dreams, vacation or the lack of vacation, maybe having planned a vacation and then not being able to take it, major change in eating habits. There's a lot of stressors that COVID-19 and the need for physical distancing has had an impact on our daily lives. So I hope you had a chance to look that over and see if there's other ones there that are also relevant to what you're experiencing now. So I'm gonna ask Jennifer to call up a poll to get a little sense of, after you took a look at those stressors, how did you feel? How have you been feeling over the past week specifically? And then, are you surprised by your stress inventory results? We didn't necessarily do the tallying of it, but are you surprised by how many stressors you could list off that you're experiencing right now? Are you surprised if you took a moment to look at the stressors you have in your life and thought about how distressed you've been over the past week, that it was as high as it was? Or are you surprised that it was as low as it was? Or are you surprised? So I'll ask Jennifer to bring up that poll so we can get those results.
Sure. Why don't we start with the first question? In general, how distressed have you felt over the past week? And you can see that the results are overwhelmed, very stressed and struggling, pretty stressed, but managing okay, a little stressed, and not at all stressed. And we'll take a minute to let everyone have a chance to vote. Just another couple seconds. See a few people maybe even changing votes.
I'd be curious to find out if they're going up or down as they thought about it.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I'll share the results with everyone. And you can see most of us are feeling pretty stressed, but managing okay.
Great.
Mary,
yeah, we have some. I can see the poll results too. It looks like we have a little stressed and not at all stressed. There is not at all stressed is 0. So we're all experiencing some stress. We're all experiencing some stress at this point in time. And I'd be a little concerned if there was anybody who was not at all stressed with everything going on. I'd be a little worried about you. So I'm glad to see that there's a 0 as not at all stressed. And then how about the next poll, Jennifer?
So the next poll question is, are you surprised by your stress inventory scale result? And the responses are yes, a lot, a little, not really, and not at all.
And again, you can make this more general. Are you just surprised at how many stressors you had? And when you paid attention to how stressed you were, are you surprised by how stressed you are? Yes, a lot, a little, not really, not at all.
We'll take just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I'll share the results. Mary, it looks like most of us kind of expected to have some stress right now.
Oh, great. Yeah, so it sounds like we're all sort of on par, that majority of us are recognizing we're stressed, and we're recognizing level of our stress, and we've been paying attention. I'm glad to hear that. And if you haven't been paying attention because you've been just in crisis mode, I wanted to let you know that's normal too. So if you're surprised a lot by your stress results, if you're a little bit, not really, not at all of that is normal. There's no expected answer to any of those questions or to those polling questions, because we each experience the trauma in our life, the stress in our life in very different ways. But the one thing that we do need, and research backs this up, is what we really do need in our life is to recognize that stress in order to address it. This is one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin, and as a trauma therapist, how could it not be? But that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I think that's a wonderful quote for us to go into this workshop with, and recognizing we may not be able to change our circumstances. However, by simply facing the fact of our circumstances, we make significant changes in the way we view it and our response to it, both mentally and physically. It is a wonderful book that I will quote, refer to several times. It's by Laura Van Linsky, and it's called Trauma Stewardship. And she points out some of the research that supports this, that one by Brian Bride of the University of Georgia. He found that exposure to others' trauma doubles the risk that social workers will experience post-traumatic stress disorder. He also, however, found out that their awareness of trauma's effects on them was very low. And pointing out to that need, that in many ways, the reason why it probably had such significant experience or stress on them to the point where they had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was that their awareness of its effect on them was very low. It really highlights the need for psychoeducation around ourselves and the impact of trauma, even the trauma of others, the trauma that we hear has on us. So there's a recent episode of Colbert where he had his entire podcast or video cast in his bathtub, which made me laugh because there were so many of us here about, take that salt bath, take a bubble bath, take care of yourself by even going for a walk, or having that glass of wine, whatever it is that we are, or that piece of chocolate, to pamper yourself in order to respond to stress. That is great if that works for you, for those low levels of stress. However, I want to give you a little bit of a warning that when it's traumatic stress, sometimes the self-care measures we take on can actually be more harmful for us if they're causing us to not address the trauma, not address the stress, to escape from it and not recognize it. I love this article by Brianna Weiss. This is what self-care really means, because it's not all salt baths and chocolate cake. And I'll quote from her, so to set our intentions here, this workshop on addressing self-care. What she says is that self-care is often a very unbeautiful thing. It is making a spreadsheet of your debt and enforcing a morning routine and cooking yourself a healthy meal, and no longer just running from your problems and calling the distraction a solution. Self-care should not be something we resort to because we're so absolutely exhausted that we need some reprieve from our relentless internal pressure. So that's really the premise of this workshop, is to give you some tools from trauma research that help us not run from our stressors, but to address our stressors and develop some skills around distress tolerance, as well as develop some resources to help us process that experience. I just want to point out some of the scientific evidence supporting these tools and techniques. If they work for our clients, they'll work for us as well. The VA and the DoD clinical practice guidelines in 2017 endorsed prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, and other specific behavioral therapies, especially written narrative exposure. So writing about your experience. You probably have all heard about journaling as a way of processing these events, these stressors in our lives. I happen to not care for journaling. I really don't like journaling. So I'm not going to do that, but I use a lot of the tools from EMDR specifically, and I'll talk you through some of those later on in the second half of this. The American Psychological Association also endorsed cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, cognitive therapies, and prolonged exposure, and conditionally EMDR as well. I have a feeling that's going to change pretty soon. And then psychiatry, even the psychiatrists are endorsing cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR. So what? So how does this work? Why are we talking so much about exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, and rather than just take that salt bath, take that bubble bath? Why is it that this is so important? A lot of it is because of the research that's been formed around our nervous system and neurobiology, neuroscience, and how the impact of trauma on not just our mental health, but also our physical health, and specifically our autonomic nervous system. So I'm going to encourage you for a second to just think of a lemon. To think of a lemon and imagine you have a lemon right in front of you and you cut into it with a knife. You notice the juice going all over the place, and you pick up that lemon and you bring it up to your mouth and you're about to take a deep bite. Just notice what happens to your body right now. I imagine for many of you, you're probably starting to salivate. You may be even puckering up. This is one of the benefits of doing this kind of workshop live, is I get to see you all pucker up, so I know that you are. So you notice that just by thinking about the lemon, you don't have a lemon in your hand, but just thinking about the lemon, you could smell it, you could taste it. Your body responded to that thought. The same thing happens with trauma. So we have the autonomic nervous system is made up, which is our involuntary nervous system, by the way, is made up of both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. You think that the sympathetic nervous system would be the one that be sort of, it is helpful to you, but the one that sort of, has a sense of sympathy. However, this is the one that gets engaged when we really need to act and react quickly without thinking about it. This is sort of the base caveman automatic reaction. You're about to be eaten by a lion and you need to react quickly. You can see when our sympathetic nervous system is engaged, our pupils dilate. We inhibit saliva production. We don't have time to deal with eating anything. We're not feeling hungry. We don't want to eat. It inhibits stomach and pancreas and the intestines. So we don't feel like eating. We couldn't even eat if we wanted to because that stuff isn't working. It's really going right to accelerating your heart, dilating your bronchial, your lungs, get them pumping so you can get as much oxygen to your brain, as much oxygen to your muscle groups so that you can act quickly and automatically. That's when we think about trauma. That's often what gets engaged, that automatic reaction. Oftentimes, it's not part of our prefrontal cortex, our part that thinks about trauma, that can reason this isn't happening to me right now. This is all happening back here in your base brain. And because we have evolved so that we rely strongly on our thinking process in order to respond to any threats in our environment, we often think ourselves into our sympathetic nervous system, even when we don't need it. There's a wonderful book, Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine. He's a pioneering researcher and psychologist in the trauma field and founded the concept of somatic experiencing. He writes, "Today our survival depends increasingly on developing our ability to think rather than being able to physically respond. Consequently, most of us have become separated from our natural instinctual selves, in particular, the part of us that can proudly, not disparagingly, be called animal. The fundamental challenges we face today have come about relatively quickly but our nervous systems have been much slower to change. It is no coincidence that people who are more in touch with their natural selves tend to fare better when it comes to trauma. So that's points out the fact that we think ourselves often into that jail, but also if we are aware, again, if we're able to face what's happening to us both physically, mentally, spiritually, that holistic sense of ourselves, then when we're able to face that, we're better able to respond and recover from those trauma. Not have no reaction, by the way, but to be able to respond in more helpful ways with less adverse consequences to our body and to our mind. The parasympathetic nervous system is the one that helps us calm down when we need to. When the trauma, the experience of near-death experience has happened and we need to bring down our hyperarousal or bring up our hypoarousal to a more functional level of plane. So you can see from some of this, if the sympathetic nervous system inhibits saliva production, the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates saliva and tear production. As oftentimes after traumatic experience, we just feel this need to cry and we just can't seem to stop our crying. It's our parasympathetic nervous system kicking in to help protect us, to help try to bring us back down to that zone of functioning. This is a lot of reason why drinking cold water can be really helpful when you're feeling overwhelmed. Also really important to keep hydrated so that you're not more prone to going into your sympathetic nervous system too quickly. Stimulating your stomach, pancreas, and intestines is another way the parasympathetic nervous system engages. So again, eating something small, eating those crackers or something like that that stimulates your parasympathetic nervous system by stimulating your stomach and your digestive system. That's a little bit of the research and why this works. And as we go through the experiential part of the second half, I encourage you to just pay attention. What a part of me is reacting right now? What part of me is feeling the stress? Am I noticing my heart racing? And do I notice when I start to produce saliva in my mouth? My heart actually tends to sort of slow down as well. Or maybe I take that sip of water and I know that I feel a little bit less anxious now. So I encourage you to notice those things as we go through the experiential part of this, those self-care measures that we're going to be doing a little bit later. So I have another question for you. Where do you notice stress primarily? I know there could be more than one answer to this, but are you somebody who tends to say, oh my gosh, I was so frustrated by that experience. I was so angry. I was so overwhelmed. Do you go right to your emotions? Or do you find that when you're talking about stress, you tend to say, oh, my shoulders were right up around my ears. I feel so stiff. I can't seem to sleep. I just can't seem to sleep during this stressful time. Or are you somebody who tends to go through your thoughts? I would say, I was just thinking how terrible this is. I was thinking about all that everybody's going through. And I was thinking about, do you find that you're noticing that you tend to go towards what's your thoughts? You're reasoning your way through this traumatic or stressful time. Now I'm going to turn that over to Jennifer to give you that poll.
So where do you feel stress primarily? Your thoughts, emotions, body, or you're not sure? We'll take a couple minutes, but I'll tell you that there are a lot of votes for all answers.
Jennifer, could they click on more than one? You can click on.
I'm not sure. I thought they could only click on one, but from the responses that I'm seeing, it looks like people can click on multiple answers. Which is great because I know I feel it, all of those, for sure.
Yeah, the one that I feel most primarily for me is definitely the tension in the shoulders. That's my warning sign. Less than my emotions, because I'm a I was born and raised in New England, and we just don't go to that primarily. It'd be much more likely to talk about how I was thinking about this, but it definitely, when I don't notice how I'm feeling about something, it shows up in my body, mostly in my shoulders.
Well, that reflects, Mary, what I think participants today are saying as well.
Yeah. And it looks like we have a really self-aware group too. There's a lot of people in the body, a lot of people in emotions, the thoughts, and sometimes we're not sure either. Maybe it could be all three, or it varies. Some days, we're going through a especially stressful time where it's too difficult to recognize the emotions around it. We may be finding it more in our bodies than in our minds or in our emotions. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. So if any cognitive behavioral therapy people out there, you will recognize this chart. This comes up later in the vicious circle diagram that is also in your handout, by the way, as another tool that you can use. But it just points out that the strength of cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR and DBT is this recognition that our thoughts, our feelings, even our physical and emotional feelings, and our actions are all tied together like cogs in a wheel. If I have the thought, I can't stand this, I'm going to feel really frustrated, concerned, worried. I'm going to feel my heart starting to race. And then my actions might be to avoid, to get out of there. I don't like this feeling. I don't want to deal with this feeling anymore. I'm going to just go for a walk and get away from it. Nothing wrong with that. That's just what happened. If my thoughts are, you know what, this is really hard. I know this experience before. I've had this experience and I've been able to deal with it before previously. I need to just keep working right now. I need to get this done. My feelings might be still frustrated, overwhelmed, scared, and might still feel some tension in my body, but my actions might change. I might decide, you know what, I got to get this done before I go for that walk. So those thoughts, feelings, and actions are intimately tied. And that's a lot of what we're going to address in self-care measures, is looking at not necessarily the feelings, the emotions, or the body reactions that we have to trauma and stress, but the thoughts and the actions around them. Because that's the places where we can make the easiest change. And the feelings, the experience of the trauma will follow suit. So the first one is obvious one. I love this acronym. I didn't come up with it. It was Jean Driscoll, who's a nurse practitioner, very active in the perinatal mental health field. So I've learned a lot from as a colleague who came up with this acronym. And as a nurse, it's NURSE. These are the things that we need anytime we're our daily lives, anytime for our holistic health, but especially when we're under stress, especially in the midst of traumatic stress, and in the midst of having to manage or process trauma. And those things are, some of them are obvious: nutrition, a sense of understanding of ourselves. This one's especially during traumatic stress, as I mentioned earlier, understanding of ourselves, but also those social connections, having somebody else understand and get you. Rest is an obvious one, though I wouldn't push too hard on this one right now, because sleep disruption is part of it. And if you feel like you're not getting enough sleep and you start to worry about it, it could paradoxically actually increase your sleep disruption. But getting times of rest, doing those meditations, having a time of rest could be going for that walk in the middle of the day if you've been feeling very stressed about work and working online. Exercise is the obvious one as well. And I wanted to point out sense of purpose. I'll talk a little bit more about trauma stewardship and some of the work around that Lipsky has done around managing our own trauma reactions to hearing these stories, but finding a sense of purpose to our work, a sense of purpose to experiencing this experience, this event, being there with another person, is often one of the most important parts of our recovery, or our ability to be stewards of the trauma that we're experiencing in ourselves and in others. Some of the complementary treatments are ones that I want to just point out there that you can also access some resources from them. I'm especially helped by yoga because it has both that mindfulness component as well as the body component, so mind and body. I find it incredibly helpful. I am not somebody who's going to sit and meditate for 45 minutes. I just don't enjoy. I don't find body scans all that helpful myself either. I really need to be moving because I hold so much of my stress and my own trauma history in my body. I need to get my body moving. And just to say a caveat too, that in working with trauma survivors throughout my 20-some-odd year history of providing trauma services, it really go with what is their strength, what they need. Same for yourself. Find what works for you. And I let you know, the example is I used to always teach people breathing techniques. Trauma survivors in general don't respond well to breathing techniques. Going back to that sympathetic nervous system that I mentioned earlier, you can think about it. If your body's gone into fight, flight, freeze, you're starting to breathe like this, and it's in that hyperarousal state, it thinks it needs to do that to keep itself safe, to keep itself from being killed by being eaten by that lion. And you tell it to suddenly stop and bring its breath down to its diaphragm and slow its breath, it may freak out because it's getting alternate experiences, alternate information that doesn't jive. It could just confuse their brain. So yoga is often a way to do that more effectively. Or grounding exercises, feeling the floor underneath your feet, feeling the chair underneath you. But we'll go through those a little bit. Spirituality, religion, also are one great for just giving you that sense of purpose that we talked about previously. Some of the other ones, just to point out what they are, is dialectical behavioral therapy is DBT, acceptance and commitment therapy is the ACT, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and intensive family systems is the IFS. Internal family systems, sorry about that. I've heard it's very intense. So I wanted to pause at this moment to see if we have any questions that have come up as I've been talking. I know I'm trying to give you a lot of information in a very short period of time. And I also really want to get on to the experiential part to teach you some of these skills, these tools that I've been talking about. But wanted to pause just to make sure I'm not missing any questions or comments.
So there was a couple of things that came up, Mary. So one of them was that in the beginning with the survey of stressful events, some of them were positive. They weren't all about destruction and loss. So I wonder if you could, if the audience member, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how positive things can cause you stress.
Yeah, very much so. I think if you can, I'm hoping all of us have gone on vacation at some point in time, but you can tell just from the experience of remembering what it was like to go on vacation, all the prep work that had to go on to that, all the making sure that your mail has been is stopped until you return, putting all the email announcements saying that you're going to be gone on vacation. There's a disruption that happens. There's a transition from your sort of like pre-vacation person to your going on vacation person. And that period of time in between, it can be really, really stressful. Just getting, and then also just the disruption in our scheduling, which a lot of us are experiencing right now in COVID-19. But that same disruption happens when we go on vacation. It's unfamiliar. So all our senses are sort of on guard to pay attention to what's different. You may go to another place where your primary language is not the primary language of where you're going on vacation, and the stress around having to communicate, it just becomes a little bit more intense, and your nervous system is sort of, hyper functioning in order to adjust to that change.
No, that makes sense. I think to all the people that wished weekends would last forever, I think most of us are regretting that wish right now. Those of us that
Yeah.
are, I guess, lucky enough to work from home. But another question was about that list again, and a lot of it was about actual trauma. So about the positive. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit now, or if you're gonna in the ahead of about like how does vicarious trauma work versus actual trauma, the death of a loved one versus what versus losing people that we work with as clients, and sort of what the differences are with that.
Yeah, and it's definitely not an exhaustive list, and it also wasn't a trauma inventory. It was mostly just a life stress inventory. But a lot of the research is showing, especially Brian, who I mentioned earlier, his research, that a lot of the effects of hearing trauma, that secondary traumatization, can be just as impactful as actually experiencing it yourself. In the articles that I gave at the very, very end of this presentation, I list a couple of articles. I have to look at it myself to remember which one it was. There's one titled Vicarious Traumatization in General Public Members and Non-Members of Medical Teams, Aiding COVID-19 Control. Really excellent article because it's current for one thing, but what they looked at was the impact of traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma on medical providers. And not surprisingly, maybe surprising for some, but not for myself, having done trauma work for quite some time, not surprisingly, the biggest impact or the most symptomology of vicarious traumatization happened in the general public and in non-first responders. They had really much lower rates of vicarious traumatization for those people who were right on the front lines treating COVID patients, right there in the room with them and responding. And I think it was interesting because it points back to that sense of purpose. What the nurses who weren't right there in the office reported was they felt worse about not being there, that their colleagues were going in, that their colleagues were experiencing this. So they were having that vicarious traumatization reaction, was almost in part because it wasn't their trauma, and because they couldn't do anything to help them. I felt that way very much sometimes early on in my trauma work with clients, was I couldn't do the work for them. I had to let them experience it. They had to do it. I couldn't control their behaviors. And so they're showing really high rates of vicarious traumatization when you don't have that sense of being able to activate, respond, and then process that trauma.
Interesting. And I assume the medical providers on the front lines felt they had at least had a little bit of control over outcomes, or they could do something about it, whereas the people watching from their living room had nothing they could do.
Yeah, they have an action plan, and they had a sense of purpose. There's a purpose to experiencing this heightened state of arousal. I have to respond, rather than I'm feeling this heightened state of arousal and it doesn't make sense to my brain. I'm not actually in danger. I'm not having to save somebody's life. I certainly feel like I do. That's what really confuses our brains oftentimes.
No, thank you. I think.
Well, do we have time? Do we have one more question, or I think I might go on?
No, I think that covered the question so far.
Oh, great. And feel free to add more questions as we go along, especially if you have any questions about what you're experiencing during the second half. So this is the practice makes progress. You might notice that I did not say practice makes perfect. There's no perfect way to deal with this. And if your goal in practicing any of these tools, techniques is to be perfect, or to address the issues of trauma perfectly, or to even get rid of the experience of stress, it's going to be less effective. I know it sounds paradoxical. We all want symptom relief. I don't want to feel this feeling anymore. But going back to that sense of hyperarousal that we talked about with the sympathetic nervous system and the way our brain has adapted to sort of think ourselves out of crises, if we start to think that our thinking is now the problem, my feelings are now the threat, we'll only go back, sort of circular process of, you know, feeling that my thought is a threat, my feeling is a threat. Our bodies will respond, we'll experience hyperarousal, we'll start to feel more in danger, and that will only reinforce that thought. Oh, I knew I was right. This feeling is a threat. I need to get rid of this feeling of anxiety. We'll actually feel even more anxious. So practice makes progress, not perfection. I also, as we go through some of these, I really encourage you that if it's not working for you, just take a break. You don't have to experience each one of these things. You don't have to go through these, but practicing it a little bit can be really helpful, and knowing how to also use it on your daily basis. You know, again, if I was a tennis instructor and I never played tennis, you wouldn't want to come see me. So I really encourage you to practice these so that you can use these with the older adults you're working with. You could talk somebody through something that they're having a really stressful time. But also, more importantly, it will help you be more engaged, help you feel more comfortable in your own skin, help you process the communal trauma that we're all going through right now with COVID-19. Go gently with yourself. So these categories are really more in the resource development phase of trauma treatment. And I want to say a little bit more about that. So in trauma treatment, we'll always start with helping people manage the stressors, manage their physical reaction to those stressors, and we practice some distress tolerance skills, some tapping into those internal resources and those external resources we have available to us in our support groups and our community, and our religious beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, as well as those ability to control our own bodies and try to bring down the sympathetic nervous system. Always do that first before we process the trauma, before we go into that traumatic material and try to sort of clean it up. The best analogy I've ever heard about what trauma treatment really is all about is if you imagine your work desk. It's clean, you've got some papers on there, but generally you're kind of on top of things. And somebody comes by and dumps a whole box load of paper. They dump it out of the box onto your work desk. Papers go flying all over the place. You're completely overwhelmed by the amount of paper on your desk. You could do a couple of things. You could get really angry, stand up and smack that person right in the face, and deal with that trauma of having had all those papers dumped all over your desk. You could just say, oh, well, I can't do anything about it. This is too much for me to deal with. I'm just walking away from it. You walk away from it, the papers are still there. They're not being cleaned up. They're not getting processed. The other one, and these tools that we're going to present to you are really meant to help deal with that, so you can deal with that anger, that frustration, all those emotions that may prompt you to walk away, or to fight, flight, freeze. They're meant tools to get you there, but then eventually you do need to sit down at the desk and get all those papers put in order. And that's where the actual trauma processing comes in place. As far as that's concerned, that's where the cognitive, I'm not going to do EMDR with you right now. You need to do that more formally with an EMDR therapist. But that's where the CBT and cognitive processing therapy tools that I mentioned here come in place. So we're going to start with EMDR. We're going to start with talking a little bit about DBT, and then we'll talk about how, once you've got that in place, when you have those resources in place, you can then look at those thoughts, look at the way that this transition, this time of trauma has impacted you, and look at the story, look at the vicious circle. So I'm going to encourage you first, we're going to do the container protocol. And this is actually also in your workbook. It's near it's page 4 in your workbook if you've been able to download that, and you can see that either on your screen or if you have a paper version. We're going to do the container protocol. And with EMDR, it is also very body-centered. We pay attention to what's going on in our bodies, we imagine what's going on in our bodies, but you can also do a little of the other component of EMDR, which is something called bilateral stimulation. Simple as giving yourself a hug. Hopefully you can see my arms, but I have my arms crossed over, called the butterfly hug, and just giving yourself a hug while we're going through this, and then tapping one side and then the other side. So not both at the same time, but one side, then the other side. If you want to be a little bit more discreet about it, you could just cross your arms if you're in a meeting. But if you've been doing that, it's going to make your supervisor think that you're bored and you're questioning their comments. You can even just do it on your knees. Or you can even do it with your toes. You can tap one side, the other side if you're on the table and you don't want somebody to see you. But the main gist is you're tapping one side, then the other side. So I'm going to encourage you to find a position that's most comfortable for you, where you can tap one side and then the other side. And then just notice your sit bones firmly planted in the chair. Notice your feet firmly planted on the floor. Just notice where your body is at right now. And notice how it feels. Maybe try to find a comfortable position, or at least a position where you're not slunched over too much. And then I'm going to ask you, we won't stay there very long, is to bring up one of those stressors that you noticed when we began this workshop. One of those stressors, one that's probably somewhere in the middle, like a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. Don't choose a 10. Don't choose a 10. And maybe don't choose a 1 either, unless that a 1 is pretty big for you. Just notice one of those stressors, bring it up in your mind, bring up the thoughts that go along with it that are causing some of that distress. Like, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe this is happening. I'm so frustrated with myself. And just notice where you feel that in your body. Just very briefly bring up that stressor and notice where it is right now on a scale of 1 to 10. Is it a 1? When you brought it up, it went up from a 4 to a 5? When you thought about it, did it go up even higher to like a 6? Or when you thought about it, did it actually go down a little bit? And then bring up all the emotions that go along with that stressor too. Frustration, anger, irritability, feeling overwhelmed. And just notice that feeling. And then I'm going to ask you to gently switch your attention, or to imagine in your mind's eye, perhaps maybe it's right in this room, but it's somewhere outside yourself. Just 2 feet outside yourself, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. Maybe it's physically distant, so it's 6 feet, at least 6 feet away from you. And imagine a container that's just outside yourself, close enough that you can put stuff in it. And that container can be anything. I've heard everything from a plastic Rubbermaid container to an under the bed container to an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Because that container can be anything in your mind's imagination. And imagine that container is just outside yourself. Notice anything that you think about that container. Notice its color, its size. Notice where it's sitting, how close it is, how far away it is. And then I want you to imagine now that you're taking those distressing images, those distressing thoughts, those distressing feelings in your body, and you're taking them just as if they were a ball right here in the center of your chest. You're taking them and you're taking them outside yourself and laying them into that container in whatever way feels most comfortable for you. So you may be throwing it in there a little bit at a time. You might take it in one big pile and just sort of dump it into the container. You're putting all those feelings into that container. And if it's helpful, you might want to close your eyes. Imagine that container being right in front of you. And imagine all those feelings, those distressing feelings, those uncomfortable feelings flowing out through you and into the container. Is there anything else that needs to go there? When you go back and do a little inventory, is there anything else that needs to be put into that container as well? And then do you need to shut the door on that container? Do you need to lock it securely? Or is it an open container where it can just sit in full view for everyone to see? Do you need to make it more secure by putting a lock on it? And how does it feel now to know that you can take that and put it aside ever for a short period of time, for a long period of time, that you are in control of putting that aside, putting it aside so you can address what needs to be addressed right now? Should we leave the container in the room here, or should we put it away? Should we put it into a filing cabinet? Should we put it up on a shelf? And just notice that feeling. Notice the feeling of that distressing feelings flowing out of you into that container. And imagine the container getting filled. And I'm going to encourage you to notice that feeling and what it feels like, and then do a couple of the taps. Do a butterfly tap, or tapping on your knees. And notice whatever thoughts come up, any distressing thoughts related to even just doing this exercise. Those thoughts too can go into that container. Maybe there's some distressing feelings, thoughts that don't seem to want to leave. Is it okay to let them just sit there and move on their own? You can get creative with this image, this meditation as you'd like. Whatever fits with your personal point of view, your history, your experience. It may be good enough just to know the container is there if you do need to put those feelings in later. Just do a couple more taps, noticing that feeling of all the stressors, all that experience, whether it's your own stress or somebody else's, but you're just putting it aside for just a moment. If you need it later, it'll be there again. You can always go back to the container. Or if you need to, you can lock it up and put it away securely, as long as you need. Now tapping right and left, right and left. I'm going to encourage you to bring your attention back to this present moment. Bring your attention back to the feeling of the chair underneath your sit bones, the feeling of the floor underneath your feet. You may even want to press those toes into the floor, press the heels of your feet into the floor, press your sit bones back into the chair. And just notice your presence right here, where you are. Changed or not changed from that experience. Just noticing whatever it is that comes up for you. Anything that comes up for you, without judgment, without having to change it, without having to make it something different. Your body knows what it needs. Your mind will do its own healing. So that's one. And feel free to put in the chat function any questions you have about that experience, any comments you have about that experience as well. Love to hear from you. So anything that you've got from that experience. And then I'm going to encourage you to, we're going to move on just to explain a little bit about the other ones that I've given you. And again, these are in your handout. So one of my favorite from DBT, from dialectic behavioral therapy, is the tip skill, which is changing your body chemistry, really playing and using that sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system response and your body as your tool to help bring down the distress. So this is a distress tolerance tool to help you manage those high levels of distress. It's not meant to be a processing tool, by the way. It's to manage those high levels of stress. And I've done this myself. So the first one is the T is to tip the temperature. So putting your face in cold water can calm you down really fast. Be careful about doing this too quickly. You know, don't put your face into a big bowl of ice water, especially if you have any concerns with a heart condition. We don't want to shock your body. So this could be just taking a cool cloth and putting it on your forehead. I had clients who used a little bit of aromatherapy as well as the tip scale, the temperature scale, by putting a lemon in the freezer, and they take that lemon out and just put it at the top of their forehead, or maybe lavender, a lavender sachet that you keep in the freezer, and you just put it on your forehead. It replicates the feeling of putting your diving into the water. If you're going into the water, you can't be breathing heavily because you will drown quicker. So you can hold your breath a lot better if your parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, if you're underwater, so that you don't drown. This sort of replicates that for your body and gets your body thinking it's underwater, so it calms itself down. The other one is, the other side of that is intense exercise. That's the I. Actually increasing your body temperature by getting it really good and revved up. Engaging in intense exercise for just a short period of time. It expends your body stored energy, physical energy, by running, walking fast, jumping, as well as changing your body chemistry and your the temperature of your body. So again, that can be just enough to sort of trigger your parasympathetic nervous system to engage rather than your automatic sympathetic nervous system. Paced breathing is another one that you can use. The basic gist is you just want your exhale to be longer than your inhale. And that's because when we inhale, we're engaging our sympathetic nervous system. You can see trying to get as much oxygen as we can. And then when we exhale, we're engaging our parasympathetic nervous systems. Yeah. So again, you might notice this is not a breathing technique. It's just simply having yourself breathe out a little bit longer than you did in. So if your inhale is just a 2 second, then you want your exhale to be 4 seconds or 3 seconds. So you see that you don't have to force it to be 4 seconds. You don't have to do a certain breathing exercise or hold your breath. You're just having your exhale be longer. And then I want to really draw your attention to the self-soothe through the 5 senses. This is another one that we're going to practice. There's a long list. Oh, I didn't have it in this one, so sorry about that. The one that I send out to you, I'll definitely make sure that I have this self-soothing, but it is in your workbook as well. There's a long list, but the basic gist is, you can see it here. The basic gist is that you're trying to engage your senses. So this is a mind-body technique again, engaging your senses to bring in some more material, some more information to balance out the distressing information that you're experiencing. So if you're getting information into your brain that says, I am in danger, smelling a flower gives it more information telling them that, well, maybe the danger isn't so bad that I don't have time to smell a flower. So using your senses through vision, hearing, smell, or taste. I'm going to encourage you now just for a moment to again bring up that distressing feeling that you had previously. Notice where it is now on a scale of 1 to 10. Has it gone up since our last exercise? Has it gone down since our last exercise? Has it stayed the same? Where is that distressing feeling, that distressing thought, that distressing image for you right now? And just notice it. Let it sit there. So we're not trying to distract you from it. We're just balancing it out, as if you could almost put the distressing feeling in one hand, and then you're going to put something else in the other hand to give you a more balanced view. Not like this, but also not like this. We're not putting too much into the other hand so that we're no longer experiencing a distressing feeling. You notice that distressing feeling, and then I'm going to encourage you to also notice 3 things that you see right now in front of you. Just 3 things. Whatever your mind goes to, what do you notice? If you're at your work desk, what do you notice at your work desk? If you're in the kitchen, what do you notice there? What are 3 things that you see? And then I'm going to encourage you to notice 3 things that you feel physically. That could be anything. That could be, notice the feeling of your breath on your nose, the chair underneath your sit bones. You may notice that your sweater's a little bit tight after you washed it last, especially around the arms. Anything that you feel physically. And just notice that. And then I'm going to encourage you to notice anything that you hear. This is a little harder. You may not be able to find 3, but just bring your attention to your hearing. What do you hear? Maybe especially something that you wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't brought your attention to your hearing. Like I had been very aware of the humming of the fan on my computer, but I just noticed that it's also I can hear my refrigerator making the same noise. Oh, now I can hear an airplane going overhead. I hear some birds, and maybe even a dog barking. Just notice what you're hearing. And if we were if you have food in front of you, if you have a glass of water like I do, you might notice what you taste. But the feeling of drinking that water or that tea or the coffee that you have, just notice that feeling of taste. Notice the taste. You may also notice the smell. 3 things that you smell. I actually brought with me, this is my own aromatherapy, I brought some of my lilacs onto my desk so I can smell those. Notice the smell. Smell can be a really effective way of managing distressing feelings. So just notice those 5 senses. And then I'm going to encourage you just ever so briefly to go back to that distressing feeling again and notice if it changed. Did it stay the same? Did it increase, decrease? Whatever do you notice about that change? And then go back to that self-soothing. And think about how you might be able to use the self-soothe technique when you're in the office, when you're working with a participant, or you're with a resident or a client. How could you use the self-soothe technique if something they're telling you is really distressing, really overwhelming? I worked with a psychiatrist once who told us what she used to do is when she was hearing something that was causing her to become very emotional that a client was telling her, she would notice the feeling of the pen in her hand. She'd start to feel whether there was smooth spots, rough spots, and she'd really focus her attention onto that experience of holding the pen in her hand. And that was just enough to get her back into the zone of tolerance, her ability to feel those feelings that the client or the patient in this case was telling her without becoming overwhelmed by it, without becoming so overwhelmed by her own emotional reaction that she really couldn't feel like she could stand it. So just noticing that pen in her hand is really helpful. So then I'm going to, so Mindfulness of emotion is one that you can really easily Google and look up. I didn't include that in the handout, but it's basically just being mindful of those emotions when they come up. We've been doing it all along, by the way, when we've talked about the distressing feelings. Just being aware of those emotions without having to push them away or hold on to them. Sometimes it can be helpful to think of it as an image, and probably many of you have heard this image of either clouds in the sky, where your brain is the blue sky, and those emotions are, or your body is the blue sky, and those emotions are the clouds coming in and floating out. Or others have talked about it being leaves in a pond or on a stream, just noticing those emotions. They're just sitting there. You're just noticing them without having to get rid of them or hold on to them or grasp onto them. Sometimes even giving the emotion a color can be really helpful and effective. And then I want to draw your attention to, which is also in your workbook, the basic cognitive behavioral diagram formation, which I find can be really helpful in managing especially issues around trauma or traumatic stress. This is the part about processing it. What we know what happens when we process trauma is we move from a way of thinking, a way of being in this world, to a different way of thinking, a different way of being in this world, because something came into our lives that disrupted that old way of being, that old way of thinking about it. And we know that people are able to process trauma most effectively when they're able to adapt their real lived experience with that way they view the world, with their thinking. So telling your story is a great way of doing that. Finding some way, either through Facebook or a public service announcement, working with support groups, telling your story in some way can be really effective, even if you never even share it. One of the worksheets I've given you in the workbook is nightmare scripting. You can use that also as a formulation without it necessarily having to be a nightmare. It could be just a daydream or way you were thinking about something and putting that into that worksheet. In the nightmare scripting, you basically write out the story just the way you remember it, just the way you experienced it. So you could write out your feelings, the experience of hearing a client or a resident's or consumer's story, and what you experienced in that. And then you can rewrite it. Rewrite it looking at those themes that cause you the most distress. For example, I might write about the experience of having a client who, or an older adult I worked with, who became really, really overwhelmed to the point where I felt like I really messed up and approaching that trauma, that experience too quickly. And I might write that story about how that happened and my own feelings of feeling like a failure, that I had done harm to this person. And then I could rewrite it after the fact, looking at that theme of failure. And what actually did happen is they told me when they came back in that session is that that was incredibly helpful to them, even though it was difficult, and begged me to continue to do trauma therapy with them. So I could rewrite it. You don't want to rewrite it in a way that's unrealistic and not possible. You want to rewrite it, pointing out those things that actually did happen, bringing your attention to that balance, those things that were helpful as well as those things that were difficult. Our minds tend to focus on the bad because that's what we do in order to keep ourselves safe. We know that being right next to a lion, a wild one, is dangerous. We register that information, that's a good thing. But if we only notice the lion, we may also not notice that he is tame, he's behind a glass, or he's at the zoo and he can't harm you. So we're also noticing that's what the rewriting or rescripting is all about, is putting that pane of glass between you and the lion, if it's really there. If it's really there, noticing that pane of glass is there as well. And then going back to that vicious circle, this is another way of imagining it. So I'm going to quickly lead you through this, and then I want to leave time for questions. So we have about 15 more minutes. So this will only take about 5 minutes, and I'll leave 10 minutes or so for some questions as well. But the basic gist of this is you, in the internal circle, you notice what thoughts, feelings, images are coming up for you that are distressing. You notice what feelings, emotions, body, physical sensations are a reaction to that feeling, that thought, or that image. And then you think about, what did I do at that time when I had that thought? Or what do I feel like doing right now? What's the behavior that's a consequence of those thoughts and those feelings? If you were a fly on the wall, what would you have seen yourself doing, or how would you have been reacting to those thoughts and feelings? And then you go the outside circle and you look for an alternative, or again, that balance to those thoughts and feelings that are causing you distress. Again, not trying to get rid of those thoughts and feelings, images, just getting a balance and trying to figure out maybe in some way what they're trying to teach you by having those thoughts and feelings. Is this a fact or opinion? What am I reacting to? What's the bigger picture? Again, using those senses to look outside yourself. And then you look, how could I act or feel? How could I respond? What are some other emotions or feelings or thoughts I could have to the situation? Is it something just telling myself this feeling will pass? It's a not normal body reaction, more helpful than becoming reactive to it. And then you can also see from that, what other ways of reacting, what behaviors may I be more prone to do? What could I do that would be more helpful in the situation? And it took me a while to talk you through it, but it's as simple as thinking, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling, what would be more helpful for me right now? A really effective trauma treatment, even though it sounds ridiculously simple. And again, you don't need to be trained to do it. So I mentioned quite a few times this book, Trauma Stewardship by Laura Van Den Linsky. I'm horrible about saying her name. Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. I really encourage this book because it's not only theoretical in how to respond to trauma, and especially vicarious traumatization, but it gives you some real practical ways to address it. What I like about her perspective about trauma stewardship, it's not focused on just our individual reactions that we have been doing today and just managing trauma within ourselves, but she states that trauma stewardship is more like environmental stewardship, and that we can use the analogy of cleaning up a river. If we're retrieving and recycling plastic bottles, trying to clean up that river from the pollution and other debris we find floating by, we'd have to be doing that all the time. We'd have to be managing and cleaning up all the time. But if we just pick up the trash and dig out polluted sediments at the stretch of the river directly in front of us, we need to identify, we can't just do that. We also need to identify and address all the sources of the pollution to figure out what is going on that's causing us for this pollution to happen. We can do the same thing with trauma stewardship. And by doing that, we are looking not only at our individual selves, but also our organizational and societal factors. This is a daily practice, she points out. We've been talking about daily practice, which we think about the hardships, the pain that we've been witnessing in others, as well as in ourselves, and a recognition that we are all experiencing this human experience, that suffering in some ways is very much human. It's a human experience, but that suffering also can be transformed into meaningful growth when a quality of presence is cultivated in the midst of it. So these exercises are there to help ultimately not just yourself, but your organization, society in general, as we start to address the issue of trauma stewardship, that this is a collective experience. We're all human. We're all in this together, as we've been hearing over the past month. But there is something that can actually, meaningful growth can come out of these experiences when we are present to them and present for each other. I put up this quote here because I love this quote. I'm sure many of us who are in the helping professions have heard this many times. You're such an angel. I could never do that job. You are an angel. And it is really, really hard to do this job, but it's not impossible. And it's not just your responsibility either. It is our collective responsibility. It's the responsibility of our organizations. It's the responsibility of our society to be in this job together. So you don't have to get to the place where the mouse in the cartoon is, where he had an epiphany and he's just going to stop altogether. But he can continue to run on that treadmill and continue to provide care to the older adults we work with, continue to hear their stories, continue to sit with them in the presence of the trauma and the pain that they're experiencing, but not to the point where we're just running in a treadmill. We're sitting there and being very present, not just to care for ourselves, but also to care and to be stewards of the trauma we're hearing. So these are some of the articles that I mentioned, as well as the Brianna West article, and then many of the handouts from the workbook are from this getselfhelp.co.uk, and then Laura's book is there as well listed. So thank you so much. I hope my biggest hope was that this would be helpful to you all. I really wish I could see you and I could hear some of the questions you have, but I'd love to. I'm going to open that up now. Wish we could have more of our repartee or back and forth, but hopefully I got some questions and I can respond to those now.
Wow, thank you, Mary. So there's one question you probably can't answer, and then two other questions. One was, where can I get more of Mary? That was a question. So I don't know how much your family's willing to share, but do you have a website?
Well, you can contact me through Jewish Family and Children's Service, because I am definitely an agent of an absolutely wonderful organization that has lots of resources there in addition to just me. You know, there's we have CJP Direct, and my colleague, who I think is also on this phone call, Margie Sokol. We have wonderful group, Beth Salzberg, who works in Alzheimer and dementia care, Ann Muskoff and Parkinson's. So we've got lots of resources there. So you can get more of all of us by contacting the Jewish Family and Children's Service.
That's
Kathy,
great.
Kathy would be very happy, my supervisor.
Yeah. That's great.
When I talked about trauma stewardship and being organizational as well as a society, I can tell you I've worked in places where it was really difficult to not have vicarious traumatization from just the interactions between me and some of my colleagues. It was a really difficult place culturally. Jewish Family and Children's Service is not one of those places. It's really, the trauma stewardship is very much a factor there. And so I encourage that, find that in your own organizations to be that change agent.
Excellent. And so being the concerned people we are about others, so what are those techniques that you taught us all would be helpful in working with the older people we serve, the older clients? Because the one question said, you know, they have a few that could use some of the DBT skills about getting control over emotions, but I wonder if there was any that work better with people with mild cognitive impairment over the others, or if you had any hints about that.
Yeah, well, especially with the cognitive impairment, I think going right back to that body source. So hydration, drinking, eating healthy, that nurse, make sure that all those categories every day are being addressed. I've even had, I don't think I can call it up right now, but made a worksheet that was nurse bingo. I know we overdo bingo, but
excellent.
I like bingo, where it has the nurse at the top, and then each end there was different things you could do to manage nutrition, which is including taking your medication. Nutrition, something under understanding, and they got to check it off, and when they checked off 5 in a row, they got a prize. So you can make it really fun. You can make it really practical. And then the ones that we did after the fact, getting people to take walks and encouraging people on each walk, socially distanced, physically distant walks to stay safe, but to notice changes that they see in their environment. That there was no buds on the tree one day, there was many bugs on the tree the next day. I happened upon this. I didn't know about these DBT skills at the time. I was a new therapist. It's just a natural. I had an adolescent I was working with who's always on her phone. And so I finally said to her, I said, why don't you go outside and take some pictures of the flowers and things that you see? It was the best homework she ever had, because she came back with multiple pictures of all these things that she was grateful for, all these things that she had loved, and she was so excited to tell me about them. If I had asked her to tell me 3 things she was grateful for, she would have given me some snarky answer.
No, that's
so
perfect.
Same way with, I think, older adults when we work with them. Nobody wants to be told, do this exercise. They want to be helped to find what's going to be most helpful to them. So that's an example of maybe just having them go out and notice, or if they're an artist, to sketch some of those things that they see.
So the one last question, then I'll turn it over to Jennifer. But besides the obvious, which is turning off the TV, we're bombarded throughout the media of some mostly wrong information, but also correct information about COVID-19. So how do you protect yourself against hearing all that, especially since there's been a lot of talk recently about 90% of all the fatalities from COVID have been people 60 years and older. So how do you shut that off in your mind if you can't shut it off physically on the television?
Right. Well, that's a really good example of how we can shut it off. We can walk away from that work desk, using that analogy, full of paper, but it's still there. It's still there. So I actually encourage you not to shut it off, to not try to get rid of those feelings, but to recognize them as this is a normal reaction to a whole bunch of pandemic.
Yeah.
I won't say the word that came to mind at first. I guess Brene Brown actually has I just recently heard, thank you, Margie, for pointing this to me, a catchphrase of FFT.
You can Google it to find it out.
You can look it up. You can look it up.
This is the G-rated audience.
Yeah. But the basic gist is that this is the first time. This is the first time any of us have gone through this.
Yeah.
So of course you don't know. Of course you can't expect to feel okay about this going on. And the example of that cognitive behavioral, cognitive processing therapy is looking at those stuck points that sometimes for people, it's that stuck point is, I should be able to deal with all this. I should be able to deal with all this. And sometimes the most effective alternative thought is, I can't deal with all of this. I can't be expected to do this on my own. So looking to see what's causing you distress, what are the thoughts, and then not having to get rid of them, but just to think about what would be more helpful. A wonderful client who expresses perfectly, we kept doing emdr together, and she kept coming back more and more distressed and was really angry at me because her preferred cognition was, I'm strong enough. And it went completely against everything she had ever learned in AA, which is that she's not strong enough. So she was trying to convince herself of something that she fundamentally did not believe. And when she realized, she said, I am strong enough in this together. Or we're strong enough where I'm not. Something that came up with that phrase. That she realized that was causing her distress was her trying to be strong enough, and she knew she wasn't. So that's why it's really, really important to go back to what am I experiencing, not trying to get rid of it. Because then you can address it.
And
we can't change anything that we don't face.
And it's okay to not be strong.
Right, exactly. And
This is
that
great.
feeling of not being strong enough might be what you need to hear in order to get you to go out and get some help. To tell your supervisor, and they're not going to be happy about this, but tell your supervisor, I'm overwhelmed, I need a little bit more support.
This is perfect. I'll turn over Jennifer. This is perfect. Perfect timing.
Great. Well, I have never felt so well rested after, or in my body and my mind after a webinar. Mary, thank you so much for this much needed information, but also the skills and strategies that I know I'll be using this week. Thank you very much, Mary. Rob, thanks very much for moderating, and thank you to everybody who attended the webinar today. When it ends, you will see a brief questionnaire on your screen very shortly afterward. I promise it will take less than 1 minute, and your feedback is really important. So please, please take a minute to do that. We'll really appreciate that. On behalf of all of our sponsors today and our presenters, thank you very much for joining us. And this concludes the webinar.